Page 12 of today's printed calendar, the Governor has vetoed House Bill 1234. House Bill 1234 is an act to amend and reenact sections of the Code of Virginia relating to school security officers carrying a firearm. The Governor's veto is printed in the calendar, available online and before the body.
Gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Langenfelder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the body override the Governor's veto and would like to speak to the motion.
Gentleman may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, just to briefly summarize what this bill actually does, I think it's important for us to take a moment and just think about what it actually does. It authorizes a school security officer to, one, carry a firearm in the performance of his duties if he is a retired law enforcement officer who meets the firearms training requirements for law enforcement officers. Two, that the local school board grants him the authority to carry that firearm in the performance of his duties. And three, he is not otherwise prohibited by state law from possessing a firearm. Mr. Speaker, I've been down here a while. There are many good people who have brought bills to me for people to carry firearms in schools for protection, armed school teachers for protection. And they know that that has not been my preference. I don't think that's the best solution to deter the unthinkable in a school. The right decision is a trained law enforcement officer who knows how to handle a firearm in a very fluid and dangerous situation. This bill that I brought this year is designed to give this body and the next a legitimate and safe and thoughtful alternative to the intentions that have been brought to me in the past. This bill creates a very high standard and incorporates all of the precautions needed to ensure our children are safe and the teachers that teach them in our schools. The local law enforcement officer a retired law enforcement officer is required who knows how to use a firearm properly in a shooting incident. A recurring training requirement is present, and safeguards to ensure the law enforcement officer is not otherwise ineligible to possess a firearm. This bill will increase the level of security for our kids. Right now, Mr. Speaker, and it's important for you to remember this as you get ready to vote, currently only school resource officers, now those folks are people who are armed police officers or deputies who work for local law enforcement. They're on the payroll of local law enforcement. Right now, they're the only ones who can carry a firearm in a school. And they are actually not employees of the school system. What this bill would do is say that school security officers who are employees can do that if the school system says it's all right. This bill gives the localities the needed flexibility to address what is a real shortfall. There are not enough resource officers to go around to every school. They're not. This bill fills the gap. This bill gives a local option for our schools to make a decision that is best for them. Not a state mandate, a local decision. Again, the governor's veto statement makes no sense. It's as if he never read it. In the second paragraph, he makes the point that under the current law, school security officers are, quote, employees of the school division who do not receive training regarding firearms and appropriate use of force with juveniles. Allowing additional firearms in schools without appropriate training would create an environment that is less rather than more secure. In other words, he acknowledges in his veto statement what this bill is actually designed to fix: to hire professionals, in this case retired law enforcement officers, and ensure that they're trained for the job. Then he says that there's not a distinguishing between law enforcement officers who retired from another state. Again, this would be a local decision they are more than capable of making, and localities would need to ensure the officer was trained as required by the bill. So the governor's point, quite honestly, is moot. Finally, the governor makes the case. He makes the case for this bill by saying in his statement, quote, "We must do all we can to keep Virginia's students and schools safe, all we can. In order to achieve that goal, it is essential that only trained, active law enforcement officials be authorized to carry firearms in schools. This is precisely by hiring retired law enforcement officers. This is precisely what the bill does." It's as if he didn't even read it. Unfortunately, the governor and the school children of the Commonwealth, this veto will endanger our kids given the threats we face. I am moved by the gentleman from Shenandoah in his previous remarks. I hope that we remember them. Like other vetoes on the gun bills today, I think we know what's going on. This veto, my fellow colleagues, and the two of you that voted for this bill when it came through this House, you should note that this veto is one that is done in indelible ink. Because if the unthinkable occurs, and there are lives that could have been saved by this bill, people will rightfully look back on this legislation. Rightfully. And your vote today, and they will ask you a question: why didn't these politicians act? Let's be on the right side of both history and school safety today and reject the governor's veto. This bill is House Bill 1234. It's designed to protect against the unthinkable so that we don't have victims 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Truly, you need to stand with the security of children and teachers today. I ask you to override the governor's veto.
The gentleman from Fairfax, Ms. Fillercorn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to this motion.
Gentleman has
Thank
floor.
you. First of all, I'd like to start by saying our governor did read this bill. He read it very, very carefully. Many of us here are parents or grandparents, and even those that don't have their own children are probably godparents or aunts and uncles. Regardless of our party or where we come from around the Commonwealth, we're all united by a common goal: to keep the Commonwealth safe, and most importantly, to keep all of our children safe. We all pray to an end to the horrible, terrible gun violence that grips our country today. We collectively shed tears for Columbine, Sandy Hook, and far too many other school tragedies. Having said that, this bill is counterproductive, counterintuitive. This bill would add more guns to our schools. This bill would would make our schools less safe, our kids less protected. This bill is counterintuitive. There's a huge difference between school security officers and school resource officers. School resource officers are employees of a local law enforcement agency who are detailed to our schools and permitted to carry firearms in the course of their duties. These resource officers receive significant and ongoing training. Significant and ongoing training. School security officers, conversely, are civilian employees and at times do not receive any training regarding firearms or the appropriate use of force. Furthermore, this bill, HB 1234, does not distinguish between differing state training regulations and differing lengths of service in law enforcement, raising questions about the uniformity of firearms training experience, which is very important. This bill further exposes, in turn, our schools and, most importantly, our precious children to unnecessary risk and potential harm by allowing people, often without adequate ongoing training, to carry firearms on school grounds around our children. I hope it'll be the will of this body to vote no and sustain the governor's veto.
Gentleman Shenandoah, Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the veto.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I hope the body just heard what the House Democrat position is on this bill, which is that House Democrats appear not to trust career-trained lawmen to guard our children in their schools. Mr. Speaker, I know the same thing about this bill that I knew about the last bill and the governor's veto, which is this, that the anti-gun agenda to which they are deferring, to which the governor has deferred, is more important than the safety of our children. How can you look at this any other way? As the gentleman from Prince William just said, these same career lawmen, and mind you, these are people, and I hope that the gentleman from Manassas chimes in here in a minute. These are people who spent their entire career chasing bad guys, fighting with them hand to hand, worrying about use of force, being trained year in, year out, more and more each year, year in, year out. In the Commonwealth, they get to retire early. Most of y'all know this. They don't work until they're 70. Most law enforcement officers do 20 years, and they retire, they get their retirement, and they look for another job, something else to do, because they're young men and women when they retire. After Sandy Hook, this idea took hold as a possible way, something we've been kicking around for a few years, a possible way to address not only our need to protect our children in school, but in sort of a symbiotic relationship, these law enforcement officers who need work in their retirement, it's a perfect fit for them. It's a way that our schools, who are already stressed by their limited budgets, can have a much more cost-effective way of protecting the children in their schools just as well or better than having a school resource officer there. You know, a school resource officer may be fresh out of the academy. That may be their first thing that they're plugged into right after the academy is this, you know, they funnel them into the schools. It's not like, you get kind of both ends of the spectrum in my experience. You get folks at the beginning of their career and the end of their career working as school resource officers in many respects. So are we safer with some rookie out of the academy who we have to pay their full-time salary, their retirement, their benefits? Is that a better fit for the safety of our children and the budgets of our local school systems? Or is it better to have a retired officer who's seasoned, who knows all the things, knows about all the things that the governor appears to be concerned about use of force, about how to handle a firearm? And by the way, as a gentleman mentioned, they still have to get trained every year. You know, don't they know how to do this? Don't they know how to protect people? Don't we trust them to do that? Of course we do. Of course, again, but logic is out the window because school safety, children's safety, not as important as this anti-gun agenda. And as long as we're talking about logic, the gentlewoman said the governor read the bill. Did he read the one that he signed into law that many people on the other side of the aisle voted for that says judges can carry a gun into a school without training, without somebody checking on them, without a law enforcement agency overseeing anything about them. A judge, just because they have a robe that they put on every day, the governor thinks that person, in signing that bill about judges, that the judge is perfectly qualified to carry a gun into school. So if that judge has a son or daughter playing in a basketball game, the judge can wear a gun into the school just because he's a judge. No concern about school safety there. If the judge comes to talk to a class, he can wear a gun into the school legally, according to the bill the governor signed. But a lawman who's been in who's been in law enforcement for 20 years can't do that. 30 years can't do that. Makes no sense. The only thing that makes sense is what I said, which is that the anti-gun agenda is more important than our children's safety in this regard. And that's a shame, and that's sad. You know, I think the governor disregarded logic and reason and accuracy. And as far as accuracy goes, you'll note that one of his reasons was that, somebody could be from another state, and they could come in from another state where they have much different training requirements, and they could get a job like this, and it would be really unsafe if they were a police officer in another state. I think that's illogical to start with, but I think the governor should know that the reference in the bill to 9.1-101 refers to law enforcement officers, which is defined as people who enforce the laws of the Commonwealth in the Commonwealth. So when you're writing these things, not only is it important to be logical and reasoned, but it's important to be accurate. And Mr. Speaker, there are lots of folks on the other side of the aisle who voted for this, voted for the judge bill, voted to let judges carry firearms into our schools without any training, without a permit, without any oversight whatsoever. And they're about to vote against letting seasoned career police officers protect our kids. I'd like to write that mail. Sort of swirling around in my head already, what that mail piece looks like. Do the right thing.
The gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Simon.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the governor's veto.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I was not planning to get up on this bill. I wasn't asked to speak on this, and I didn't think I would. But having sat through the last two speeches from the gentleman from Shenandoah, I feel like I'm compelled to respond in some way, shape, or form. I know that our votes are the ultimate answer, and ultimately that's the way to answer, but I just can't let that sit out there as if there's any truth to the fact that we somehow care more about some secret agenda than we do about our school children. I can't let that sit out there as the parent of a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old who go to school every day. I can't let that sit out there. Look, it's not about logic, but it is about math. It's about probability, and it's about understanding numbers, okay? I care about my children's safety. I care about the children in my neighborhood, and I know that firearms death are now the American Association of Pediatrics estimates the third leading cause of death among children. But it's an estimate, because we can't even get accurate information to make the determination, because the NRA and their lobbyists won't let the federal government study these things because they're afraid that we're building some sort of agenda. So, you can't talk about this without having some context. What about trigger locks? What about smart gun technology that's all made illegal? What about all these things we could do to save children and prevent accidental shootings that happen every day? That happen to the children of gun enthusiasts, that happen to people that find their parents' gun in all kinds of places it's not supposed to be. We care about those things. We care very, very deeply about children's safety. We just happen to have a different idea about what will make and keep those children safe. All right, this is not about not caring. It's certainly not about putting anybody's agenda ahead of the safety of my children or the children of this Commonwealth, Mr. Speaker. I would hope that we would sustain the governor's veto.
Gentleman from Carolina, Ms. Rock.
Mr. Speaker, speaking very briefly.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, it had not been my intention to speak on this matter, but as I've heard the discussion play out here this afternoon, I don't believe anybody in this body is not concerned about the safety of our children. However, I do agree with the arguments that say folks aren't looking at this logically, because let me tell you, as a school teacher, We are told, and have been for a number of years, the logic of a school terrorist threat is that a terrorist knows they've got one gun to take out, and then they've got a completely soft target, and they've got, at least for a more rural school division, 10 to 20 minutes before local law enforcement is going to be on scene. If you enact this legislation, you are now telling every terrorist threat that soft target isn't as soft as it was. Even if no school division in the state implements this policy because it's permissive, you are creating a doubt among the terrorist community. I don't know which school resource officer might be armed and which isn't. I know a school resource officer is. He's my first target. But now I don't know. And now I've got two people to search out. I've got double the potential of not being successful in my terrorist ambitions. I hope it be the pleasure of the body to override the governor's veto.
The gentleman from Frederick, Mr. Collins.
Mr. Speaker, I'll be quick as well. As a law enforcement officer who did school resource officer protections in the schools, the resources are awfully thin for the police departments. We don't have enough officers to put into the school systems. They put maybe one police officer. When we got back from legislative session, I sat in with the design of a new elementary school in one of our rural areas. They were talking about the security system they're putting in. They were talking about how long it would take for those security systems to be defeated. And the whole idea was, hopefully, the police will arrive in time because we do not have a full-time school resource officer for our school. And when I asked them about having armed security guards, they said they're perfectly okay with that. They're a rural area. If they're a school employee who is trained to use a firearm, I was a firearms instructor as a law enforcement officer. This is what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen. We're not talking about putting guys in Kevlar jackets and camouflage with M60s out front in Humvees. We're talking about individuals employed by the schools who are trained to use firearms, retired law enforcement officers. That's what we're talking about. And we're having our schools designed to try to defeat individuals coming into the school, but it's a delay tactic, not a security measure. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have to say.
Gentleman from Powhatan, Mr. Ware.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for a motion.
Gentleman has the floor.
I move the pending question.
Gentleman from Powhatan, Mr. Ware moves pending question. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Pending question is called for. Shall the House vote to override the governor's veto? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 66, noes 34.
Ayes 66, noes 34. The motion is rejected.